September 1941, occupied Europe was holding its breath. German boots struck the cobblestones of a railway platform somewhere between Paris and Brussels. Floodlights cut through the early morning fog, illuminating lines of civilians pressed shoulder to shoulder, papers shaking in their hands. The Gestapo officer at the checkpoint barely looked up as another woman stepped forward. She was unremarkable mid-30s, coat worn thin, a basket hanging from her arm. The kind of face that vanished into crowds. The kind no one feared. Inside that basket was enough information to kill thousands. The officer glanced at her papers, stamped them without interest, and waved her through. The woman did not run. She did not look back. Her heartbeat thundered so loudly in her ears she was certain it could be heard. One wrong glance, one careless gesture, and she would disappear into a prison cell or worse. Instead, she walked calmly toward the train, carrying maps of German troop movements sewn into fabric, memorized codes burned into her mind. Secrets that could change the course of the war. This was happening all across occupied Europe. Not by soldiers, not by men trained for combat, but by women the Nazis dismissed as harmless wives, students, shop clerks, mothers pushing bicycles, girls riding trains, couriers hiding messages in hems, lipstick tubes, prayer books, even their own memories. The Germans believed women were invisible. That belief would become one of their greatest mistakes, because while the Reich searched for armed resistance fighters and shadowy spies, a quiet war was already being fought in daylight across checkpoints, borders, and interrogations by women who learned to smile while carrying death in their pockets. And if even one of them was discovered, the consequences would be swift, brutal, and final. What the Nazis never realized was how many had already slipped through their lines and how much they had already lost. By early 1942, nearly all of continental Europe lived under occupation or constant threat of it. Cities once alive with cafes and music now survived on whispers and shadows. Curfews strangled the nights. Radios were confiscated. Newspapers became instruments of propaganda. Every wall seemed to have ears, and every neighbor could be an informant. The Nazis did not need armies everywhere. Fear did the work for them. In France, Belgium, Poland, the Netherlands, Norway, and beyond, public executions were staged without warning. Bodies were left hanging for days as messages. In the streets, signs appeared listing names of those shot while trying to escape, though everyone knew the truth. Escape was rarely attempted. Silence was safer. Or so people told themselves, but beneath that silence, something else was forming. At first, resistance was small and fragmented. It isolated individuals passing rumors, hiding fugitives, scribbling notes they burned moments later. The German intelligence network was vast and ruthless, trained to dismantle armed resistance groups. Men of fighting age were watched closely. Soldiers, engineers, railway workers, anyone who looked capable of sabotage was automatically suspect. Border checks focused on them first. Train compartments were searched with brutal efficiency. Pockets turned inside out. Shoes cut open. Backs broken in interrogation rooms. Women, however, were dismissed. Nazi ideology was blind in a way that would cost them dearly. Women were seen as politically naive, emotionally weak, focused on home and family, not capable of coordinated espionage, not capable of treason at scale. At checkpoints, they were searched less thoroughly, questioned less aggressively, sometimes not at all. A woman with a basket was assumed to be carrying food. A woman with papers was assumed to be visiting relatives. A woman on a bicycle was assumed to be insignificant. The resistance noticed. What began as coincidence became strategy. Women were suddenly everywhere. They needed to be on trains crossing borders, in markets crowded with German officers, cleaning offices where documents were left unattended, working as secretaries, nurses, switchboard operators. They memorized schedules, overheard conversations, copied maps by hand, committed entire troop movements to memory. Written evidence was too dangerous. If captured, paper was a death sentence. So they learned to carry everything inside their minds. Daily life became a battleground of choices. Walk the long way to avoid a patrol or risk suspicion by being late. Memorize a code in one night, then forget it on command once it was delivered. Practice smiling until fear no longer showed. Learn how to answer questions casually while calculating exits. Counting soldiers. Listening for tone changes in a voice that could signal danger, resistance networks began to knit together quietly. Couriers met in bakeries, on park benches, at tram stops. Messages were exchanged through harmless phrases, talk of weather, prices, children. A loaf of bread cut a certain way meant one thing. A missing scarf meant another. Trust was fragile. One wrong introduction meant death for everyone involved. And still, women volunteered. Some had lost husbands or brothers in early arrests. Some watched trains carry away neighbors who never returned. Others simply refused to accept that survival meant obedience. They knew the risks. Capture meant torture designed not just to extract information, but to break the will entirely. Survival was never guaranteed even for those who said nothing, yet every week, more step forward. They were not superheroes. They were terrified. But the occupation had taught them something brutal and simple. Doing nothing carried its own cost. And so quietly, invisibly, the most underestimated people in Europe became its most effective messengers. By mid-1942, the Germans were intercepting fragments of Allied intelligence that made no sense. Codes appeared uncompromised. Sabotage happened in places thought secure. Convoys were ambushed with impossible timing. Plans seemed to leak before they were executed. Investigations intensified. Checkpoints expanded. Searches grew harsher. Still, the pattern remained unclear. Because the enemy did not look like an enemy, and as suspicion slowly crept closer to the truth, one courier, unknown, unarmed, and entirely ordinary, was already preparing to cross a border carrying information that, if discovered, would cost not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had trusted her. They did not look like heroes. One was barely 20 when the occupation swallowed her university. Before the war, she studied literature and dreamed of becoming a teacher. When the Germans closed the campus and repurposed the buildings for their officers, she took work as a typist. It seemed harmless. But every day, as she retyped orders she wasn't supposed to read, her eyes lingered just long enough to memorize dates, unit numbers, destinations. At night, she burned the carbon copies in the stove and whispered the details to a resistance contact, who wrote them in code and passed them on. She never wrote anything herself. If she was caught, there could be no proof, only knowledge sealed. Inside her head, another woman was a mother of 2 in a small Belgian town near the border. Her husband had been arrested after hiding a downed Allied pilot in their barn. She never saw him again. When the resistance approached her months later, she didn't hesitate. She delivered messages while pushing a baby carriage, notes hidden inside the lining beneath her child's blanket. German soldiers smiled at her, sometimes waved. None of them ever searched the prom. Each trip across town felt longer than the last. Fear, pressing tighter with every step but stopping, was no longer an option. There was also the nurse. She worked in a hospital commandeered by German forces, tending to wounded soldiers who cursed her in languages she barely understood. While changing bandages and checking charts, she listened. Troop trains delayed. Reinforcements expected. Units near the front running low on supplies. She memorized everything, then repeated it to herself until each detail was engraved in her mind. When her shift ended, she rode her bicycle through back roads to meet a courier. The bicycle frame contained nothing, but the route itself was coded. Which road she took, which one she avoided, told the resistance what it needed to know. Not all of them joined for revenge. Some did it because survival demanded it. A shop clerk in Amsterdam began stealing ration cards and forging documents. At first, it was only to feed her family. Then she realized what false papers could do. She learned to stamp passes that allowed Jews, escaped prisoners, and resistance fighters to move freely. She hid her tools inside false drawers, practiced folding documents into shapes that fit perfectly into clothing seams. Every time the shop door opened, her heart skipped, convinced this would be the moment the Gestapo walked in. They all shared the same fear, Interrogation rooms were whispered about like places that existed outside time. People went in and returned broken or didn't return at all. The women knew that resisting meant choosing the worst possible end if discovered. They trained themselves not to cry under pressure, not to react to screams in nearby cells, not to flinch when boots echoed behind them at night. Still, they continued, because the occupation had already taken so much. What made them effective was not just courage, it was invisibility. They learned how to be forgettable, how to act bored, tired, invisible, how to smile at the right moment, how to let soldiers talk while appearing not to listen, how to remember everything and give nothing away. Information moved through hands that shook, across borders, crossed on foot and by train, hidden in loaves of bread, stuffed into coat hems, sewn between layers of dress fabric. Sometimes nothing was written at all. The message lived only in memory, rehearsed again and again until it was safely delivered and then deliberately erased. No one knew the whole network. That was the rule. If one of them fell, the rest might survive, but as their successes grew, so did the danger. German counterintelligence had begun noticing patterns, operations failing too precisely, sabotage occurring too cleanly. Someone was feeding the Allies exact information, and slowly, quietly, suspicion began shifting. Not toward men, toward women who passed unnoticed every day, and one of them, unaware she was already marked, was about to walk into a routine inspection. That would test everything she believed about trust, sacrifice, and how long invisibility could really last. The farther the war dragged on, the farther the women were asked to go. By late 1942, German checkpoints had multiplied across borders like scars. Papers were checked twice. Luggage was dumped onto platforms. Trains were stopped in open countryside. While soldiers walked the aisles, faces close, eyes searching for fear. The resistance knew the lines were tightening. That was exactly why the missions became more dangerous and more essential. One courier was ordered to cross from occupied France into neutral territory, carrying details of a division relocating east. The information couldn't be written down. It existed only in her memory, repeated like a prayer as she stood in line at the border. When the officer questioned her, she answered calmly, inventing a sick aunt, an overdue visit. He stared at her longer than he should have. Her hands ached from clenching them together inside her coat. Finally, he waved her through. She walked for nearly a mile before allowing herself to breathe. On another route, a student courier rode a crowded train packed with German soldiers. Hidden inside the lining of her coat were microphotographs of coastal defenses. Halfway through the journey, the train jolted to a halt. Gestapo agents boarded and began searching passengers one by one. The woman thought of standing up, of running, but she didn't. She stayed seated while soldiers moved closer. When they reached her, one tugged sharply at her coat. The lining held. The photographs remained invisible. She smiled, apologized, endured a long glare, then watched them move on. At her destination, she locked herself in a public restroom and vomited before finishing the mission. Not every encounter ended in escape. In the Netherlands, a courier failed to notice a tail. She delivered her message at the usual cafe, unaware it had been compromised. 2 streets later, she was grabbed from behind and dragged into an unmarked car. She was interrogated for days, beaten until she could no longer stand. She never revealed a name. Eventually, she was sent to a camp. The network she protected survived, but her position was never filled again. Those who remained learned quickly. Routes were abandoned overnight. Safe houses disappeared without warning. Codes changed weekly. Trust became even more fragile, necessity outweighing suspicion. Every delivery felt like it could be the last, and yet the intelligence kept moving. Reports on rail schedules allowed sabotage teams to destroy tracks minutes before troop trains arrived. Information on fuel shortages shaped Allied bombing priorities. Details about patrol rotations made ambush possible. Numbers scribbled in. Memory by terrified couriers months earlier began appearing in Allied command briefings. The cause and effect was distant, invisible to the women risking their lives day after day. But it was there. One of the most dangerous missions came in winter. Nurse Courier was tasked with delivering information about coastal reinforcements days before a planned Allied operation. Heavy snow slowed travel, roads were closed. Checkpoints were on high alert. She rode her bicycle anyway, documents stitched into the hem of her skirt, listening for dogs every time she passed a wooded stretch. At a temporary roadblock, soldiers ordered her to dismount. One noticed the stitching. His fingers brushed against the hem. Time seemed to stop. She laughed softly, embarrassed, and explained she had repaired it herself. The soldier hesitated, then let it go. The group waved her forward. She rode on shaking. So badly she nearly fell, knowing that if he had cut one thread lower, she would have been executed on the spot. By 1943, German intelligence understood something was terribly wrong. Entire operations were being anticipated. Sabotage occurred with precision that suggested inside knowledge. Interrogations intensified, arrests increased. Women were now being stopped more frequently, searched more aggressively. The advantage of invisibility was eroding. Still, the missions continued, because stopping would confirm everything the resistance feared, that the war would be lost not by gunfire, but by silence on one spring morning as Allied forces prepared. For a decisive phase of the war, a courier boarded a train carrying the most sensitive information her network had ever moved. This time, there would be no redundancy. If she failed, the operation would fail with her. And when the train doors closed and soldiers began walking the aisles, she realized too late that someone on board already knew exactly who she was. The collapse did not come all at once. It came in whispers, missed meetings, empty safe houses, and doors that were never opened again. Early warnings were subtle. A courier failed to arrive at her usual time. A contact name stopped circulating. A cafe that once buzzed with coded conversation went silent overnight. At first, each absence was explained away, illness, delays, caution, but deep down everyone understood the truth. The network had been touched. And once the Germans identified a single thread, they had a terrifying talent for pulling until everything unraveled. The betrayal was never announced. It was discovered in footsteps behind you that didn't fade, in questions that felt too specific, in arrests that happened minutes after a delivery. Someone had talked. Or someone had been broken. Arrests came at dawn. Women were dragged from beds in front of children who were told to look away. Papers were seized, floors ripped apart, clothing searched stitch by stitch. Those taken were blindfolded, driven to buildings with no names, and pushed into rooms where the air already smelled of fear. Interrogations began immediately. There were no formalities. No rules. The Germans understood silence was the enemy. They used isolation first hours, sometimes days without sleep, lights kept on, voices echoing through walls. When that failed, the beatings began. Not chaotic violence, but calculated pain designed to measure breaking points. Names were demanded, routes, codes, who had given orders, who had received information. Most of the women knew only fragments by design. Networks were structured to prevent total collapse. But even fragments were dangerous in the hands of trained interrogators. The women weighed every breath carefully. Each second of silence protected someone else. Somewhere else, some endured longer than anyone thought possible. Student courier endured weeks without naming a single contact. When the beatings stopped, the fear intensified. Quiet meant something worse was coming. Eventually, she was transferred to a camp. She survived the war but never spoke of what she had endured. Others were not so fortunate. Executions were swift and meant to be instructional. Notices were posted publicly. Bodies were left where they fell. The message was clear. This is the cost of resistance. And for a time, it worked. Fear froze entire neighborhoods. Movement slowed. Messages stopped. The psychological toll extended beyond those arrested. Survivors were haunted by guilt, by the names they imagined uttered under torture, by wondering whether their silence had been enough. Mothers who had carried secrets in baby clothes now questioned whether survival itself was betrayal. Every knock at the door became a moment of dread. Every friendly face a potential informer. German counterintelligence moved efficiently, cataloging methods, adjusting tactics, refining predictions. Instructions went out to search women more thoroughly, to ignore nothing. The arrogance that once blinded them was gone, replaced with cold responsiveness. Invisibility was no longer guaranteed. One courier was arrested carrying nothing at all, no papers, no codes, only memory. She was interrogated for days, the Germans convinced she knew more than she could prove. She never confirmed their suspicions. They executed her anyway, and still, the resistance did not completely die. Fragments of the network survived by dissolving further, becoming smaller, quieter, almost impossible to trace. People changed names, routes, faces. Messages slowed but did not stop. The cost was unbearable, but the alternative, surrender, was worse. By the time Allied planners began preparing for the war's turning point, those still operating understood one truth above all others: the women who smuggled secrets were no longer invisible. Every mission now carried the weight of inevitability, and somewhere deep within the German intelligence apparatus, files were being assembled, connecting dots that would soon point to information so damaging that its delivery, if completed, could alter the final phase of the war. If any of the remaining couriers were caught now, there would be no second chances, and one of them was already under watch. By the spring of 1944, the war had reached a knife's edge. Across Britain, Allied commanders prepared for an invasion whose success depended on secrecy and precision. Maps covered walls. Timetables were revised endlessly. Every decision, where to land, when to strike, which defenses to avoid, could mean the difference between liberation and catastrophe. And quietly embedded in those plans was intelligence that had not come from satellites or generals, but from ordinary women who had risked everything to move a few pieces of truth across occupied ground. Reports, smuggled out of France, confirmed which coastal batteries were real and which were decoys. Messages carried through train stations and border crossings revealed troop concentrations shifting away from Normandy. Misled by successful deception campaigns the resistance helped sustain. Information about damaged rail lines and fuel shortages showed exactly where German reinforcements would stall once the invasion began. Each detail seemed small on its own. Together, they changed the shape of the war. Sabotage teams acted with confidence because couriers had memorized guard rotations and delivery schedules months earlier. Bridges were destroyed at precise moments. Signal lines were cut just long enough to cause chaos, then disappeared from view. When D-Day finally came, German command structures fractured more quickly than expected, not from lack of courage, but from lack of information. The resistance had blinded them. Many of the women never knew the full impact of their work. They did not hear the briefings. They did not see the maps. They only knew that requests were slowing, that some routes were being abandoned, that new instructions carried a single quiet word: successful. In one village, a former courier learned the truth only after liberation. A British officer confirmed that information she carried in her memory for 18 terrifying hours had influenced landing decisions just days later. She wept not from pride, but from the delayed weight of fear she had never allowed herself to feel. The turning point of the war did not roar. It crept forward, disguised in everyday movement, hidden in women who walked past soldiers without being stopped, sometimes for the last time. By the time German intelligence fully grasped the scale of what had been lost, Allied forces were already ashore, and resistance networks emerged from the shadows to openly sabotage retreating units. Some of the women who had once moved invisibly through checkpoints now guided Allied troops through unfamiliar territory. Others watched liberation from windows, knowing how close it had come to ending very differently. Not all lived to see it. Files later recovered from German offices revealed just how close the network had come to complete destruction. Names crossed out, arrest records incomplete, interrogation notes marked insufficient. Even in their final assessments, the Germans struggled to believe how extensively women had operated beneath their control. History would take years to catch up. The war ended with victory parades and speeches that honored armies and commanders. The women who smuggled secrets returned to lives that no longer fit who they had become. Some spoke only to family. Others never spoke at all. they had won the war in fragments, in whispered numbers, in seconds of courage that never made headlines, and as the world rebuilt, their greatest victory became their final silence, because exposing themselves fully would have meant unraveling the last fragile threads of survival in a world still recovering from what it had almost lost. The war did not end all at once. It slowed, exhaled, and then stopped, leaving behind a silence almost as heavy as the occupation had been. In the weeks after liberation, flags reappeared in windows that had been bare for years. Soldiers marched through streets once ruled by fear. Crowds cheered. Photographs were taken. History, it seemed, had found its heroes. But for many of the women who had smuggled secrets across Nazi lines, victory felt strangely distant, like something that had happened to someone else. They returned home to empty houses and missing names. Some found children who barely recognized them. Some found nothing at all. The networks they had lived inside vanished overnight, dissolving by design. No debriefings, no medals. Often no acknowledgement that their work had ever existed. Silence had kept them alive during the war. Now it followed them into peace. A former courier watched a parade pass beneath her window and felt her hands tremble, not from fear, but from the sudden absence of it. For years, her body had learned how to listen for danger in every sound. That reflex did not disappear when the Germans left. Sleep came in fragments. Ordinary footsteps still made her heart race. Others were asked to forget. Governments quietly discouraged stories that complicated the official narrative of victory. Some records remained classified. Some sacrifices were deemed too dangerous to discuss. And some women, having spent years erasing traces of themselves, found it easier not to speak. Only later did fragments of the truth emerge, files released, testimonies shared, names restored to history. Slowly, the invisible war became visible. The uniforms gave way to ordinary clothes. The spies to faces once dismissed as harmless, what had once been brushed aside as coincidence, or luck, was finally understood for what it was. A hidden network of courage that carried the war on its back when open resistance would have failed. They never asked to be remembered. That was never the point. But they proved something impossible to ignore, that the war was not only fought in trenches and landing craft, but in occupied kitchens, crowded trains, and moments when a woman chose not to look afraid. Their greatest victory was never recognition. It was the future they helped make possible, quietly, invisibly, and at terrible cost. And even decades later, the full weight of what they carried is only just being believed.